Thanks, Rich. Yeah, but that's okay. Good morning. My name is Danny Wyndham. I am with Digium. On behalf of ITEXPO and the TMC team and Digium Asterisk World and the team from Digium, I'd like to welcome you here. I'd also like to thank you for being here, and I'm interested in knowing how many of you were here last year. All right, pretty good number. So I'm going to assume that all the rest of you are here for the first time, or maybe you've got rotator cuff damage from answering all of Rich's questions. And in the year that we've had since we were here last year, a lot of things have changed. One of the things that was interesting to me is when we were here last year, and I gave a keynote presentation, I would say that we were at the peak of panic associated with what was going on in the world's economy. We were worried about world bank failures. The economy was in meltdown. Our U.S. economy was shedding jobs at 600,000 or 700,000 jobs a month. It was a pretty scary time. And I stood here and predicted 2009 would be a very challenging year. Now, given that backdrop, that might not have been a very insightful prediction, but I think for many companies that came true. And that got me to thinking about just how different things were at the end of this decade, that decade, than they were at the beginning of that decade. And just speaking of that decade, I don't really know what to call it. You know, the 2000s, that's kind of hard to say. The zeros or the nils or the nadas, none of that makes sense. So I just remember a term my grandfather had for zero, it was naught. So I'm going to call this the naught decade. And my first impression was that the naught decade for the telephony industry was the decade from hell. And then I started looking at the things that happened in that decade and trying to answer the question, was it the decade from hell or not? So I'd like to spend a little time today trying to answer that question. I think we could all agree that the telephony industry that existed at the beginning of the naught decade has little resemblance to that existed at the end of the decade. So, at the beginning of the decade, things were really good. It was a very happy time on Wall Street. The economy was strong. This industry was healthy and wealthy. Y2K had driven infrastructure upgrades and driven a lot of revenue for the suppliers in this industry. We all survived the clock striking 12 at midnight on Y2K, and the world didn't come to an end, and we were happy about that. Nortel's market cap in 2000 was in excess of $300 billion. Lucent's market cap in the year 2000 was in excess of $250 billion. And it was 2000 that Avaya spun out and created its own separate company. And there were a couple of events that at that time might not have seemed significant to the communications industry, but ultimately turned out to be very significant. The very first version of Cisco Call Manager was introduced. Now, Cisco had acquired Celsius in 1998, and they had marketed a product under the Celsius brand for a year and a half or so, but 2000, the very first introduction of a Cisco-branded call manager. And in Alabama, a little project had been started that at this point was really just an infant because it was less than a year old, but it was the Asterisk open source telephony project. If I compare that to the end of the decade, however, in 2009, it was a pretty scary time. Industry was in turmoil. Our economy was in turmoil. The world economy had essentially melted down. And if you compare what the vendor landscape looked like at the end of the decade versus the beginning of the decade, what you would find is that market caps had plummeted for one, but all these companies that were public at one point, including Avaya and Siemens Enterprise and Mitel, had all become private companies, and now Nortel, at least the enterprise division of Nortel, has become a private company through the acquisition by Avaya, who later today, I suppose, is explaining how they're going to bring those two products to market as a single brand. Now, admittedly, Avaya didn't buy all of Nortel, but just pretend that the enterprise assets were worth a third of Nortel at the beginning of the decade or so. That means what was worth $100 billion at the beginning of the decade was worth less than $1 billion at the end of the decade. And so if you were a stockholder there, you saw less than 1% of your value across a relatively short 10-year period. And meanwhile, back in the open source world, Asterisk turned 10 years old. So if we look at what happened during the decade from a user's perspective, I think things are very different today than they were at the beginning of the decade. If you were accustomed to running voice services inside of an enterprise, particularly, then what I think you would say at the end of the decade is that the big iron PBX market is a dying market because voice has become an application that runs across a data network running on standardized hardware. Separate telephony departments are headed toward extinction. So if you're in a company that has a voice and a data department today, I think you're very much in the minority. Those have been combined. Long-distance charges are no longer the single biggest line item on an IT budget. So at the beginning of the decade, I think it was very common for companies, particularly for the recurring portion of their IT budget, that long-distance charges were the single largest line item driving that. And you spent a lot of energy trying to figure out how to minimize that. If you look at what happened from a market share perspective, let's look from the voice market, the single largest market opportunity is for PBXs. So let's look at what the market share was in the year 2000 for PBXs. This data, by the way, is compliments of Eastern Management Group, who has tracked the PBX market for the past 25 years. And they suggest that at the beginning of the decade, Avaya and Nortel combined had more than 50% market share. And there are names on this list of companies that have merged together, Intertel and Mitel as an example, and names of companies that no longer exist. And if you compare what the market share looked like at the end of the decade, Avaya and Nortel together still have a sizable market share, but it's significantly less than half. Oh, sorry. And there are new entrants on this slide that didn't even show up in the year 2000. Cisco and ShoreTel, as an example. But possibly the most surprising fact on this slide is that the leading market share holder today in one decade is really not even a company. It's open source telephony, which has created an entire industry around open source telephony. Eastern Management also tracks what has happened to pricing in this marketplace. So I believe this is manufacturer-suggested list pricing, and it's the average selling price of what PBXs cost at the beginning of the decade versus the end of the decade. And there's more than a 33% drop in just the equipment cost, not to mention the cost of managing it and all the other costs associated with it have been reduced as well. So what happened? What drove all of this change? And I think you can look back and identify a number of very high-level industry trends that we can say were responsible for driving these changes in the marketplace. And if we sort of start maybe at the beginning of the decade and work our way through the decade, the very first one is that data networks became reliable enough to support voice. I believe at the beginning of the decade, many companies thought, you know, I really hate for my data network to go down, but business transactions in my company are conducted by people talking to people, and I can't afford for the voice network to go down. And so we had this gold-plated, highly reliable, highly available voice network, and we were reluctant to put voice onto our data network because it didn't have the same level of reliability. But if you look at how business is transacted today, I believe the majority of business is transacted with computers talking to computers. Electronic data interchange, web-based credit card orders, none of those require voice-to-voice communication, so we evolved into a position where it became imperative that the data network be as reliable as the voice network had traditionally been, and as that happened, it became okay to move voice onto that network. IP became the preferred transport layer for all data types. Now, if we were debating this at the beginning of the decade, I'm not sure that we would have all predicted that IP would win. There were transport protocols that were engineered specifically with the goal of addressing data types other than data, voice and video, minimizing latency and making that work really well in the presence of bandwidth being very expensive. However, that premise didn't hold true, and IP won that war. And as IP won that war, then voice over IP began displacing the traditional TDM telephony model that was in existence at the beginning of the decade. Bandwidth costs plummeted. This trend contributed to IP winning the war. IP maybe was never the most latency bandwidth efficient protocol we could have chosen, but because so many organizations were deploying IP in the enterprise for local area networks, it drove economies of scale. The pricing of the technology associated with IP allowed it to win that war, and it was primarily because we over-engineered the bandwidth to the spot where it really didn't matter. Bandwidth suffered from a couple of things that happened. If you think being a big iron PBX manufacturer in the noughts decade was a difficult spot to be, if you had been someone who was trying to skim margin off of bandwidth in the noughts decade, I suspect you were completely out of business at this point. But we suffered from two problems. One, the dot-com gold rush of the late 90s drove so much investment in the infrastructure that there was an oversupply of bandwidth. That happened primarily in the early part of the decade. In the later part of the decade, what you saw was disruptive business models. Skype as an example. Freakonomics, not freakonomics, but free economics. The business model drove 12% of the world's long-distance business onto a network that's providing connectivity primarily for free. Communication systems became software products. As voice became an application running on a data network, it enabled voice applications to become software and to adopt more traditional software business models in lieu of the traditional hardware models that had been existing at the beginning of the decade. And open source software. The development methodology associated with building an open source project has disrupted the proprietary alternative. So it's always interesting to go back and look at what happened. It's maybe more valuable to go back and try to understand why things happened. And in my contention, the reason all of these things happened, the one underlying trend that's common to every one of these is it's all about the money. So running a single department costs less than running two departments, which drove the consolidation of voice and data within an enterprise. Installing a single infrastructure costs less than installing two. If you've got a voice network and a data network, that's twice the cost. Bandwidth fell victim to a number of problems, but the fact that the bandwidth is a lot cheaper today has allowed us to implement alternatives that weren't possible really at the beginning of the decade. Wired Magazine published something very interesting this month. They went back and looked at the cost of bandwidth, and they looked at it with regard to Netflix. So Netflix has a relatively new service where you can stream movies to your television, and they stream movies today, I presume, in an MPEG-4 format. That's about 3 megabits per second or so, and a movie lasts 2 hours. So you can compute how much bandwidth it takes to get 2 hours worth of movie at 3 megabits a second. Now, they concluded that Netflix pays about 5 cents to be able to stream that. And if you did that at the beginning of the decade, it would have cost something in excess of $250. So more than a 3 order of magnitude reduction in bandwidth cost in less than 10 years. Standards-based, high volume computers cost less than custom big iron PBX hardware. That has enabled the trend of software running on standardized equipment to displace traditional big iron PBXs. And open source costs less than proprietary alternatives. Now, is open source free? Not really if you're going to use it and make it reliable, but open source shifts the power from traditional proprietary vendors into the hands of the end users or the systems integrators creating those solutions. So what really happened? Users seeking to lower their cost drove all of these trends. And if part of the value of looking back in time and trying to understand what happened is being able to apply that to the future, can we learn anything from the past decade that we can apply to this decade? I think the answer to that is yes. Users seeking to lower their cost will drive a number of new industry trends. So why don't we take a few minutes and speculate on what those trends might be? Well, the first one I hope is really not a trend. In fact, I hope it terminates pretty early in the decade. But the economic pressures and the economic weakness that exists in our market today is driving cost pressure within organizations to figure out how to do more with less. In fact, the downturn in the economy has taught companies how to do more with less. We've looked at the concept of job recovery in the United States and predicted that jobs are going to improve. My contention is companies have learned how to do the job with their existing workforce, and until company revenues begin to expand, you're not going to see jobs replaced just for the fact of replacing those jobs, even because profits are up. Discretionary spending has been reduced, and these market conditions now favor lower cost alternatives over their premium branded alternatives. You know, the day of you never get fired for buying X, I think maybe are over, because you might get fired if you spent way too much money to solve a problem you could have solved for a lot. And the economic pressures are raising interest in low-cost alternatives like open source. Gartner says that we had about a 4% decline in IT spending 2008 versus 2009. Now, IT is a broad topic. What impact might that have had to VoIP? Because VoIP as a category seems to be one of the brighter spots on the horizon of the overall IT spending market. So, ChannelWeb did a survey late in 2009 that suggested that 26% of CIOs see VoIP as a way to save money. So, under the theme of saving money drives behavior, VoIP maybe has a future there. 70% of CIOs expect to make near-term investments in VoIP, and according to this survey, VoIP was the fourth highest area of expected investment in the near term, and 21% of VARs named VoIP as the technology that would generate them the most near-term growth. Next trend, speculative trend, is that unified communications adoption will rise. Unified communications is a term that has a very broad definition, and just for the purposes of talking about it here, let's just say that it is a whole bunch of communications applications bundled into one complete solution. Things like voice, fax, presence, conferencing, chat, video. The market for UC products was estimated to be about $3 billion in 2009 by Forrester, but it's predicted to be $18 billion in 2012. Now, I wouldn't suggest that we're going to see a six-fold increase in the UC market in that time period. What I think is underneath that is that products that have been categorized as IP PBXs or small business phone systems in the past will morph into unified communications products. Digium, as an example, will build a product that is a small business IP PBX called SwitchFox. A prior release supported voice, presence, and conferencing, and then we added fax, chat, and video, and when we did, we started referring to it as a unified communications product, and we report those revenues that way. Mobility becomes a bigger player in corporate communications. Now, it appears that Christopher and I actually coordinated these presentations because we're even citing some of the same market research. Wasn't the case, but maybe that means that we fundamentally agree on where the market is headed. In fact, I don't really disagree with anything that Christopher said. I think Christopher's view is maybe a longer-term view, and I see some steps along the way that allow us to get to that long-term view. One of those steps is that networks, mobile networks, have to be sufficiently evolved to provide a happy user experience when you're using mobile VoIP. And 3G can do that today. Certainly 4G does that in the future. And whether the evolution is Wi-Fi, WiMAX, or LTE, or whatever, the prediction is that by the end of this decade, 50% of mobile traffic will be VoIP. Christopher mentioned that today, 15% of all mobile phones are smartphones, going to almost 40% by 2013, which says there will be 1.5 billion smartphones. And in our view, those are all things that are looking for ways to be connected to your traditional corporate connectivity. So today, most of you probably have a phone on your desktop, and most of you probably have a phone in your pocket. But the things that make this desirable for me are very different than the things that make a desktop device desirable for me. This needs to have good battery life. It needs to fit in my pocket. It needs to have a good user interface. But in terms of Skype going onto a television, Skype's going onto a television because we like looking at really big screens. And so the attributes of what make a good desktop experience include great audio quality, good conferencing capabilities, bigger screens. So I see that living into the future, and what that means is you need a way to connect these devices. So fixed mobile convergence grows in its adoption with an estimated six-fold increase in the amount of fixed mobile convergent connections that occur in the next 5 years. voice services joined the cloud computing party, maybe as a late entrant. IDC has predicted, because cloud computing is all the rage at this moment, that cloud computing will capture 25% of the IT spend in the next 5 years, and we'll see a threefold increase in what's spent there. Now, when I think of cloud computing over traditional hosted services, it makes me think of a couple of things. One, virtualization, and two, elasticity. Now, a PBX as an application really does not benefit from the elasticity portion of cloud computing. I want our company's PBX to be on 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and I want our customers to be able to interact with that. If you have an application that needs to spin up for a while and then you want to turn it off, the elasticity element of cloud computing is very desirable. However, PBX as an application can benefit from virtualization. Why? Because it lowers the cost of the hardware. And under the theme that cost drives all trends, we'll see the adoption of cloud computing, or moreover, traditional hosted voice services grow. But early on, that adoption comes primarily from smaller businesses who are better served by the underlying business model of hosted services. With digium, I would be remiss if I didn't forecast that open source continues to disrupt proprietary alternatives. Forrester recently did a study to understand the attitudes toward open source adoption across lots of companies in North America and in Europe. And what they learned was, on average, maybe 30% of companies have adopted open source today. And on average, about 40% of companies are either piloting or considering open source. And so the opportunity for the adoption of open source to double in the near term is there. There may be some of you in the audience who are of that 30% of the remaining portion that has not been exposed to open source, maybe doesn't understand what open source is. Eastern Management Group has forecasted that today, Asterisk holds about 88% of the open source telephony market. And so I predict that Asterisk will continue to be the de facto choice for open source telephony, and I'll give you some insight into why I believe that. Asterisk itself is an open source project. It's software, and it's best thought of as an engine from which you can build almost any sort of communications applications. PBX, soft switch, conferencing server, whatever. And the amount of momentum that is behind the project is the reason that I predict that one will win the open source telephony war, because it's been 10 years in the making. Today, there are more than 65,000 community members. It's deployed in more than 170 countries. There are over 2 million downloads of Asterisk just last year. There are over 800 active and current contributors. There's an extensive hardware interoperability matrix, and really it's all about the applications. There are over 150 applications available in Asterisk, either as part of the open source software or through commercial add-ons to the Asterisk project. Another reason is that Asterisk will win is the ecosystem. The ecosystem is huge. There are hundreds of participants in the ecosystem. And today, with Digium Asterisk World, which is a mini trade show, a mini event inside of the ITEXPO event, there are over 20 members of that ecosystem represented today, so I would encourage you to go by and visit them. And Digium is a sponsor and an active proponent of that ecosystem, and we are making, for us, what is a significant announcement at this show. We are announcing the Asterisk Exchange. Asterisk Exchange is a marketplace, which is a one-stop shop for all products that are Asterisk-based. So I'd encourage you to visit asteriskexchange.com. So we still haven't answered the question of, were the noughts really the technology decade from hell? Well, I can see where if you were a traditional big iron PBX supplier or one of their employees, you might be tempted to answer that question with a resounding yes. But if you were an end user of communication services and products, then during that decade, you saw your equipment costs fall by more than 50%, 33%. You saw your infrastructure management cost fall by more than 50%. You saw your bandwidth cost fall by 3 orders of magnitude. And you saw the power shift from the traditional proprietary suppliers into the hands of the end users. And so with that as the backdrop, for the end users of the communications products and services, I say no, that wasn't the telephony decade from hell. It was actually one hell of a decade. Rich, do we have for questions? All right, one question. Yes. The question is, where do we go from 88%? Well, I try not to think about it from that perspective. I see open source telephony as a market that is growing at a great rate in itself. And so the opportunity for us to grow in that overall market is great. And there are other projects out there that I suspect will gather some momentum, particularly around specific targeted problems that are trying to be solved. But as a generic application trying to solve a very broad open source telephony problem, I see Asterisk as continuing to maintain a very high percentage of that share. One more.
Yeah, can you expand a little bit on, you talked about virtualization of telephony, and you kind of indicated that maybe it was like hardware where the benefit was. What are your views overall about virtualizing telephony?
Well, by the way, there's been a lot of work done in Asterisk in the past year to enable Asterisk to run in a virtualized environment. And I still, if you'll just go back to my basic premise that things that save money drive industry trends, I see virtualization as a way to save money. Particularly for those who are hosted service providers, it gives you a very easy mechanism to spin up a service for a customer and put it in place until that customer either doesn't need it or moves to a different type of service and then take it away. In general, I see it as a way to lower cost, and I think that it has a strong future in telephony. All right, Rich, back to you.
Thank you, Danny.